Even after you have developed your product, you go to the market, the reality is that they will attack you throughout the process. Some would still nevertheless be able to enter your system and perform transaction activities. So that continuous surveillance is necessary.
Welcome to CPA Australia's With Interest podcast. I'm Eleanor Cassipedes, Chief of Policy, Standards and External Affairs here at CPA Australia. Today we're in our Singapore studio talking about financial crime. Specifically, we're talking about the growing challenge of fraud and the role of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing and the controls that are used to protect the financial system. It's an area that's getting renewed attention in Australia with new AML CTF laws being rolled out, including to professional accountants. At the same time, we're also seeing fraud risks increasing in scale and sophistication, driven by digital payments, cross-border activity and organised crime. Joining me here today to explore what this means in practice, I'm joined by Vincent Mok. Vincent has more than 25 years' experience across major international banks and now serves as Group Chief Risk Officer at GXS Bank, a digital bank. He specialises in risk modelling, data analytics, enterprise risk management, and works closely with regulators, boards and industry partners on financial crime and governance. Welcome to With Interest, Vincent.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you for having me this morning.
So before we get into the mechanics of financial crime and AML CTF, I wanted to hear a little bit about you. So you've done a lot of work across banks, and how have you found yourself in a Group Chief Risk Officer role specialising in financial crime?
Oh, that's a very long story, interesting question. Actually, I started off, finishing off my CPA program. And thereafter, I joined one of the international banks, Citibank. I started off in the retail business in the area of collections. And thereafter, I've kind of went through the journey looking at data analytics, then into credit, into then business, and also then moving on to different areas. So over time, I've kind of covered the entire kind of business spectrum, end to end, and therefore thereafter, I guess over time, opportunity came about. I was in a regional role covering 7 markets, and then the opportunity to set up a digital bank came. And of course, I think for many, that itself is really a decision in your career, because you have to decide: are you happy with your comfort zone, or are you willing to start all afresh with a blank piece of paper? I took the latter, because it's hard for an opportunity to come where you set up a bank from scratch. So I thought that would be pretty exciting. My area of specialty was actually more on credit risk and modeling, data modeling. However, I think when I landed the job here, I think one of the bigger focuses was financial crime, and the reason for that is really because as a digital setup, is things move very quick. Product offering, we do it pretty quick, onboarding in a couple of minutes. And therefore, it has incentive for financial crime or syndicates to actually target the bank, and therefore it became an area that I spent quite a bit of time in.
That's a really interesting career story, and we have many CPAs who actually specialise in data analytics right from the beginning, and with technology, digital banking is the next frontier, and we're seeing a lot of those. It facilitates things a lot more easily. People don't necessarily need to have a bricks and mortar retail bank anymore.
That's right.
So it is the new frontier. And that reflects a shift in the environment. As technology improves, you have borderless transactions, and people are moving around the world as well. They use their credit card, their bank account in lots of different regions. And that makes fraud more and more a risk that is global. It's cross-border, it's manifesting in digital systems and sophisticated. And I can, I have a little bit of history in financial crime as well. And so you see the sophistication and the cleverness, I guess you can say, of organised crime, as well as opportunistic threats as well. And regulators are always trying to catch up with the pace of change. So As you've evolved into this role from credit risk into financial crime, how do you see the landscape evolving?
I think for financial crime, it will be ever evolving. And I often use this analogy for us to combat financial crime. It's really a game of chess. You set safeguards, set controls, and then there they will figure out how do they actually bypass the system. Still, I think the intent is a simple one. It is to either bring money out of to beat the system, to move money around. Of course, I think ultimately it's not for good purposes. And therefore, in the changing landscape, I guess the reflection I had was really that how do we move from be defensive to also offensive? Because defensive, what it means is you will always end up playing a catch-up game, and you will think about what is actually hitting us, and then you implement controls and whatnot. I guess it's actually useful for organizations to think about how you reform and reshape your architecture and control. So you need not have incidents to occur before you decide to implement some control. So when we do new product development, for example, we think about what potentially could go wrong. And often, if you think about a very seamless journey, you always think customer first, and that's the right thing to do. But however, you also need to wear the hat, because what the syndicates will aim to do is to capitalize on that to beat the system. So you have to have a fair balance between speed and trust. And therefore, I think if one that is actually able to combat it better will be one that can incorporate both speed and trust in their build elements.
And you mentioned before people can set up an account in a few minutes. And so people talk a little bit around bringing some friction in so that it's not always right on time. So from the onboarding process to the money that flows through the account, and in terms of closing the door as the horse is bolted, so you will have fraud occur, but you can detect it. How do you break down when you're developing a new product that sort of psychology of the criminal so that you can test your processes?
I think one would have to kind of wear the hat of a fraudster. I mean, we may not be the best in it, but you would imagine that every process within the system that you create, be it onboarding, transaction activity, even the loan process, etc., all those actually will have that touch point that potentially be vulnerable. And therefore, in doing so, you will have to think about what kind of safeguards you put. Of course, the regulatory framework does provide some guidance, but I would say doing bare minimum will often be it will be okay as a start, but as things evolve, I would say you have to do much more than what the regulation prescribes.
It's a little bit like in IT, they get hackers, white hat hackers to test the security system. So it's almost similar in the banking sector where you're testing the product. Is that right?
Yes. In fact, as we go through the process, even with our regulator, they sometimes also wear the hat as a hacker and said, what if I were to do this? If you do, if they say, for example, they test out our selfie capability, they will say, what if I use my kid's image? Have you tested tampering? How do you deal with fake identities? So these questions actually gets challenged. But internally, of course, is almost going through examination. You often have to be very prepared in your response as well. Yeah.
There's a lot of things in what you just said, because you've got fraudulent identities. There's also fake paperwork. There's misrepresentation. I know in Australia we have instances where disadvantaged people are brought in by criminals to use their identities, and they're not necessarily aware of what they're signing up for. It's if you do this, you can get $1,000, but they don't realise that they're being used to get more. Do you see some of those behaviours coming through the system?
Yes, I think financial crime and the scammers often rely on a couple of key principles. First, focuses on the vulnerable. They attack on basically emotions and basically on fear, urgency, greed, love. These are some of the kind of principles that they have. So if you fall under these so-called vulnerable categories, more likely than not, you would either end up being on one side or the other. Whether you'll be targeted for a conduit to help them. Some end up actually being mules. And on the other side, if of course everyone earn a living, and therefore in doing so, are attracted to very attractive investments, not whatnot, and therefore they are also vulnerable, but from perspective of being a victim. Yeah.
And it's broader than just sort of AML, CTF, but yeah, touching on fraud, scams, victimization of the vulnerable. It's a really big space, and
Yes,
you
it
can
is.
never necessarily assume that you're not going to be affected or that someone else
Exactly.
close to you might be impacted as well. And the banks play a really important role in that.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, the banks, there's an expectation, and they're probably the front line of AML, CTF and financial crime detection. What does a good fraud control process look like inside a bank today? You've touched on some of the aspects, but as a risk officer, what are you looking at from a governance perspective and a product development perspective?
Governance and from a product development perspective, of course, I think what is important is think about having all the lines of controls participating in that whole journey, development journey. It is actually not just something that belongs to business or first line of defense, but when you get the various SME people who come in, that's where you get the complete perspective. However, having said that, life doesn't really stop there, because even after you have developed your product, you go to the market, the reality is that they will attack you throughout the process. Some would still nevertheless be able to enter your system and perform transaction activities. So that continuous surveillance is necessary. In my mind, what is a good control is really understanding the type of attacks that you have. So imagine, all of us has homes, you have doors and windows. Have you shut down or closed your doors and windows properly? And do you know if anything is flying in or not? So the surveillance that you had to be extreme. You, instead of putting guards, you probably have to have sensors everywhere. And therefore, if you are able to know on real time, even I would say if you could know every morning, like what the type of scam attempts that's happening, if there's anyone who try to knock on your window, then you could react. And the faster you are in doing that, the better it is. The second one is that we spoke about two things. One is on fraud and AML, but interchangeably. So if you think about it, it's perhaps two sides of the same coin. So on one spectrum, if you are looking at transaction activity, it may tell you that someone has been scammed. But if you look at the reverse, it may tell you that someone is attempting to perform AML activities. So from a governance setup, some of the more conventional practices is that we have dedicated fraud division, we have dedicated AML division, but seldom they speak to each other or they work together. And one that has integration of these two functions, I believe works better. And of course, if you think about implementing or making reforms, you really need to tone from the top. So what is needed? You really need a good sponsor who will lobby for push for the change. Because otherwise, what is just going to happen is that you will end up creating capacity to manage these volumes, but it keeps coming. So it's a question whether it's our job to just deal with what is coming or to stop it. So I think have clear narrative on that will be very useful.
Yeah. And everyone has a role in detecting these things, and all the way down perhaps in a traditional bank, the retail frontline, the customer service officers. It sounds like for you as a digital bank, you have technology, you have that constant surveillance. I love the sensors analogy. That's a really good one.
Yeah.
And you did touch on it's not just the banks. So there is a regulatory environment. There are other participants in the system. And we use the term, the system is only as strong as the weakest link.
Yes.
So how do you collaborate with others, both your customers, the regulators, other people in the ecosystem, to help raise awareness and not to have to always just deal with it at a transactional level?
One which is important is that the ecosystem collaboration, private-public coordination is extremely important. And the reason why I say that is because you could imagine many organizations, they don't get hit at the same time, the same way. Something that's actually hitting you today may hit your fellow industry peers tomorrow. And vice versa, they may see things that you don't see. And the question is really, when you're talking about fraud or financial crime, is higher the better or lower the better? Lower means you don't have the data. Higher means you have things to process, but you also learn. So it's a question of striking the balance. And the industry collaboration just means that you get signals, and the various signals combined makes it more meaningful. And I think given the scale of financial crime, it really takes beyond just a particular party to combat. It really require, you could think about, the extension. So in the past, if you're thinking about that, predominantly people think about the central bank, the police force, and the banks. But today, if you're thinking about that, right, it actually extends beyond like many industries. You are thinking about also telco, social media, where actually, some of these are happening. And you could imagine it extends to other industry as well, brokers, real estate agent, lawyers, so much. So I think that concept is a right one to actually get everybody be part of the whole system.
Harden the environment so the criminals can't get there, and intelligence. So in Australia, we have a statutory body called AUSTRAC, which is the government body that gets a lot of intelligence, and there's a lot of it's interesting because sometimes you're obviously competing on product, you're competing as a bank, but there are elements like financial crime where the cost to society, the cost to the bank, the cost to government is quite high. So do you share intelligence, not necessarily at that transactional level, but just behaviours and how they're attacking the system? Is there a mechanism for that?
We do share intel, and of course, this is actually done within the boundary of data protection as well. So it's a fine line, and we have to always exercise balance and control as we share data as well. But in terms of, I think for confirmed financial crimes, in fact, profiles and credentials are shared across system, so that everyone deals with it appropriately.
You mentioned before just the broadening of the ecosystem that can be used to control and deal with financial crime. How do you see accountants and professional advisors and lawyers? Because many times, they are supporting small to medium enterprises, or they're supporting individuals to establish these accounts. So what should they be preparing for? So from a bank perspective, you've been there, you've been in the space for a long time.
Yeah.
You mentioned doing the basics, what the regulator or what the laws require is a good start, but perhaps there's more. Are there any tips or insights for our listeners today?
Yeah, I think one is that, of course, each of the profession has a professional code of conduct. And of course, there will be guiding principles that the regulator prescribe. So one of the things that is being implemented is the concept of shared responsibility. And if you think about shared responsibility, what it really says is that everyone comes together to have protect, customers for greater good, and therefore I think regardless of the industry, it's important to differentiate who are your good legit customer versus those that is the syndicated ones and the bad ones. And I think as an industry, I think the general principles is we do business with the good legit customer. I think be it estate agents, be it lawyers, be it accountant, that same principle has to apply. And I think form over substance is the concept of shared responsibility framework. I don't think the industry needs to wait until there is an enforcement of such conduct before we do something. I guess the principle, if you know that these are important, I guess one would have to understand that everyone has a role to play. Of course, having said that, on a smaller setup, when you serve small medium enterprise, sometimes cost of implementing these controls are also expensive. So I guess this is going to be an evolving thing, but a small part done by everyone does help the system become stronger.
Yeah. I love that shared responsibility concept. And if we think about the code of ethics, there's, acting in the client's best interests. You want to have the client clients who are good, but there's also the non-compliance with laws and regulations requirements, professional skepticism, making sure that you know your client, proof of identity, that onboarding process I think is really important for public practitioners, as of course banks would do the same.
If you think about what we do in CPA Australia, ethics is really the core, and you don't get through without making sure you pass. But I think it's just beyond memorizing what is right. It's really ingraining that principle of doing the right thing, which is actually important.
And if you take that approach, then really your system of quality management, the processes that you put in place, the tone from the top. So it really is this: if you're living the code and you're living those values, it's really documenting what you're probably doing anyway, and that's a critically important thing. I'll also give a plug for, we've recently released some resources on financial abuse, being able to detect it and what to do when you see it. And then the AML CTF obligations, which is around knowing your client and reporting suspect transactions. And that can touch so many different things. I think we always think of organised crime or criminal behaviour as a problem that's over there. But in fact, I'm sure in the banking sector, you see it manifest at a retailer level, or, there are people who might be enslaved in an arrangement. And as an accountant, you're seeing a lot of the money coming through the accounts. So it's part of hardening and being aware of those sorts of manifestations.
Exactly. And of course, taking action is important.
Criminals will always find the next step. They're always testing the system. Your sensors are activated, you shut down the risk. And we now have AI using your child's face, but soon people will be able to generate pretty much, or already can, really good images, documents, fraudulent transactions even, like they can create histories that don't exist.
Yes.
How do you see AI and the latest frontier of technology manifesting in the financial crime space, and what are we going to do about it?
The concept of AI is really an interesting one, good and bad at the same time, exciting and scary. So one of the things that I guess the theme today from this perspective is we have to use AI to fight AI. So one of the things is for everyone to think about how you would leverage on that. I guess we are fortunate in that way because as a native digital bank, we don't have large workforces, but we have many of the latest tools. And basically, we do invest a lot and pretty heavily in terms of AI and the technology. And therefore, in terms of, you could imagine typically the process that we go through, we have actually built fraud and AML models that is AI driven, which we continue to improvise over time with the new data points. And therefore, the point I made earlier, whether is it more the better or lesser the better. Likewise, in terms of many of the detection process, in terms of investigation process, today we do have AI bots that is actually doing supplementary work in terms of that investigation. So I think people do talk about agentic AI as well. I think it would mature. It would take time to get there, but then at the moment is pretty much AI with human in the loop. And of course, it will be used in many fronts, and we just have to implement additional safeguards along the way and evolve our technology at the same time. It has to be a place where we don't just watch and do nothing, but really is to think about how you would evolve this space as well. So you could imagine if these syndicates have invested in R&D in AI, I guess likewise we would have to double down on that. So one of the suggestions that I've actually shared with participants was to think about how this space would be in the next 3 years, and set a perspective as in what are you going to do in your respective organization to be prepared for that. The work has to start now, because you wouldn't just change overnight. So that there's a lot of work that needs to be done ground up. Yeah.
I love the thinking about being proactive and using the technology and training the bots on the behaviors and the prototypes and the profiles of what you're seeing. And finally, I've kept on bringing it back to professional advisors, and we've talked a little bit about the governance piece, but do you have any tips around what are the priorities? So let's say you haven't really been doing AML CTF and you've got a client base. Where do they start on that journey?
I think what is important is do not start the journey when you are in the verge of getting a reprimand or a fine, because that's not a good space to be in. I guess the question is really how strong as well in terms of the respective legislation, but it is one that I think it requires that awareness and self-governance, and of course, if you could imagine if the cost of a mistake is expensive, then there is going to be the need to do the right thing. So I would imagine for the accounting profession, for example, the taxation firms, accounting firms. Imagine one day if the punitive action for sanctions or for non-compliance is a heavy penalty. It could potentially wipe off the earnings of the organizations. So if you have that mindset, I guess everyone would probably think about it a little bit more differently. I think in the banking world, of course, we are unfortunately we do have very stringent requirements, and therefore we constantly have to be on our toes, and we always I guess here in this part of the world is pretty mature. Yeah. We go to the extent of collaborating with each other while working with the regulator to set policies that we think is appropriate, and so on. So I guess the same principle should apply. It would be helpful across the industry and profession to think about it the same way.
Well, accountants love a cost-benefit analysis, and the costs can be very, very high. The fines and the consequences can be high. And as well as a profession, the shared responsibility, we do have a social obligation to clients, to the community, and taking on that responsibility is critical. So we've traversed a lot of areas today, so financial crime, money laundering, and I think it really comes down to the key points for me were the flip side. So AML CTF is the flip side of fraud. Yeah. How those criminals, and we didn't touch on opportunistic ones either, but
Yeah.
there is also a group of people who will take an opportunity if they know there's a weakness in the system. We do see the promulgation of scams through social media, and that's a whole new area as well of monitoring and surveillance to see. And that's a challenge, I'm sure, for regulators too. Yes. And as a digital bank, it's great to see how you're using technology to combat technology-related crimes. So, Vincent, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And for our Australian public practitioners, check out our AML CTF webpage, which has got a whole range of resources to guide you with your onboarding journey. And we also have an online learning module that you can take for your CPD. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to With Interest and share this episode with your friends and colleagues in the business community. Until next time, thank you for listening.